The former US Defence Secretary Robert Gates must have hit a nerve when he lamented that defence budget cuts in Britain had left it without full spectrum or across-the-board military capabilities. This was followed by a swift rebuttal by David Cameron, who insisted that Britain is still a first-class player in defence terms, with the fourth largest defence budget anywhere in the world. But indeed, British forces are undergoing changes, with a 20% reduction in regular army numbers from 102,000 to 82,000 by 2018. That reduction, of course, follows the UK's defence review back in 2010. On the other side of the pond, the Pentagon has revealed plans to scale back the US Army to the lowest level since before World War II. The US Defence Secretary Chuck Hagel recommended shrinking US forces from 520,000 to around 440,000. This is a cut of about 13%. But despite the drawdown in Afghanistan, there's no shortage of military might elsewhere in the world. Russia and China have both increased their military spending considerably. Russia, of course, in the spotlight over its deployment of troops in the Crimea, which on the weekend voted for closer ties with Russia. China, meanwhile, is seen as striving to reassert its dominance in the South China Sea, in particular regarding a dispute over territory with Japan. But with this week's budget outlining military spending in the UK for the next year, is Britain's military capability waning? Is this wise at a time when China and Russia are increasing their spending? What is the significance of this? Well, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Chris Nynham. He's Vice Chair of Stop the War Coalition. Also here in the studio is Dr. John Louth. He is Director for Defence, Industries and Society at the Royal United Services Institute, that's known as RUSI. And also here in the studio, Anthony Hall, former editor of Defence Management Journal. A warm welcome. Just this point about what Robert Gates was saying, and John, I mean, what is he right? Is the UK a less reliable ally for international partners such as the US?
I'm not sure we're a less reliable ally. I think it's true to say that full spectrum capability was certainly dented in 2010 because of the very real economic trauma that we and others were facing. It was pretty clear that carrying a defence deficit of between 38 and 51 billion pound just wasn't potentially viable. So the government took some very harsh decisions to scrap programmes such as Nimrod MRA4, Harrier, debate around the carrier programme, which certainly diminished our ability to be classified as a full spectrum capability partner. But whether we're a less reliable partner generally on the international stage, I'm not sure I would support that.
What do you think, Anthony? I mean, the sell-off of the Harrier jet force, what we have is 8% cuts from the defence budget since 2010.
It depends on what you want those forces to do. It's all very well saying they scrapped the Nimrod, removed the Harrier, but these were unproven. Well, there were severe problems with the Nimrod. The Harrier was coming to the end of its life. They would argue, the government would argue, they had to grasp the nettle. My doubts are about how the speed with which they did that. The 2010 SDR review took place between May and October. The Army had to then produce a system of cuts within 4 months.
So it happened too fast?
In a view of a lot of people, it just happened far too fast.
Would you agree with that, John?
I would agree to that in part. I think as soon as you make cuts driven by budget constraints, working out just how you're going to do it is always the very tricky problem. So sort of moving from a position where potentially the UK is overspending on its defence by net present value of about 38, 39 billion to a balanced budget by 2015 was going to make for some quite arbitrary cuts for sure. Whether we'll be able to judge at the moment whether that's been too fast or not, I'm not so sure. I think the proof will really hit us when we get to 2020 and the supposedly sort of balanced force structures around 2020. If we're approaching something that offers a high utility, is also remarkably affordable and can perhaps be embedded within other alliance capabilities, then we've probably got it right. If that isn't the picture we've got, then we've done something wrong, perhaps. Chris
Nynham from the Stop the War Coalition. I guess if a government's duty is defence of the realm, we really have to ask the question, what kind of defence do we want and what are we prepared to pay for?
The problem is that the present capacity of the British Armed Forces over the last 10 years and more have not been used for defence. They've been used for offence. They've been used for aggressive wars, interventions in various different theatres in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa, and the British people completely reject this use of our military, and they've been incredibly unpopular wars. As they've progressed, they've got more and more unpopular, and really what we need to do at this juncture is to step back and say, what should our armed forces be for? The overwhelming majority of people in Britain think they should only be for defence. They think that there should be no more foreign interventions at all. And our government needs to listen to that. And the problem is here, we're talking about tinkering, really. We're still coming out of this, even if the cuts go through, probably the fourth biggest spender on the military in the world. And that's something the British people don't want. So there should be much more radical change, in my opinion.
Are you saying that the British people, over the course of the last 15 years, and I presume you were referring to what happened in Afghanistan and latterly Iraq, but prior to that, did they have more faith in what Britain did as a military capability?
Well, I think so, and partly because Britain was doing a lot less abroad. I mean, the problem has been in the last, since 2000, 2001, or actually since the latter part of the 1990s, is that we've adopted a much more interventionist foreign policy. I mean, that's not to say we didn't do stuff in the past, but it's been an arc of increased interventions. Now, those interventions have proved absolutely unambiguously to have been a disaster, and we have to draw the conclusions from that, and the conclusions have to be, particularly at a time when our government is telling us we can't pay nurses properly, we can't employ enough teachers. It is absolutely insane for us to be spending this amount of money on weapons that only cause mayhem and murder around the world.
Of course, that's Stop the War Coalition's point of view, Anthony, but I guess the broader point, perhaps the British people do feel that really defence of the realm is completely different to intervention and to foreign policy tools.
I think you'll find there are sides blaming each other for this, the public mood. The Chief of the General Staff, Sir Peter Ward, last week made a speech at Chatham House in which he acknowledged that there was problems, perceptions about the negativity of the events of the last 10 years. But he was keen to actually point the finger of, not blame, the root of this to the politicians. Philip Hammond in the Commons has pointed the finger at the public. I think Stop the War is right. It's the public mood. The public mood doesn't want personnel disappearing off into places they can't find on a map. That is what I think that the British public will be quite happy to sort of sit back for a long time and not have any more interventions.
But that's not necessarily the point that Philip Hammond makes, John Louth. I mean, he said that you can only build a strong and sustainable defence in a strong and sustainable economy. And so he's using economic arguments for these cuts as much as anything, isn't he?
There is a strong sort of traditional economic argument that research, applied research and development in defence and security is a good thing for broader economic drivers within a society. It seems to me that there's a much more nuanced discussion to happen here. Both Chris and Anthony make strong points, but I think there are other points to sort of balance them out. I mean, if we think of we no longer want to do interventions and you reject a Sierra Leone scenario. Now, I think most fair-minded people will look at the UK intervention in Sierra Leone in 2000 and think that was, on balance, a pretty good thing and saved an awful lot of lives. And I think a similar argument could be made for the Balkans, perhaps. So I think it's more nuanced than yes or no, right or wrong.
Can I get your reaction to that, Chris? I mean, Sierra Leone, obviously only 5 years after what happened in Rwanda, where the West was criticised for standing by. Do you see, from your organisation's point of view, the value of that? And
the problem is we can get into like a bit bogged down in individual cases here. I mean, personally, I think if you step back and look at the record, even at the record of so-called humanitarian interventions over the last period, we'll find that most of them have actually exacerbated the problems that they claim to have been justified by. And that you look at the whole question, for example, of the threat of terrorism. I mean, we were told in 2001 that we were going to be fighting a war to limit terrorism. In fact, if you look around the world now, it's clear that the threats of more attacks have grown massively. So I think it's important to look at the record as a whole. And I would argue that that record has kind of proved that in general terms, you can't introduce peace, stability, democracy at the barrel of a gun.
Unfortunately, Chris, this is precisely not what's going to be happening with the new, they call it in defence engagement. The army is being reduced up to 3 brigades. 2 of those brigades are going to be used to go out and train. The world is being divided up into 9 regions, and it's a use of soft and hard power. And the view of the army is they don't want to defend on the front door, that they want to go out where the problem is. Now, whether that arrival actually causes more problems than it solves, that's a very good argument. That's what's going to happen. If there's a problem in the Maghreb, that's where they're going to be.
I mean, on that point of the problem in the Maghreb, I think the broader point Chris was making is that the nature of threat has changed. I mean, Robert Gates had made the point that today's threats are as dangerous as during the Cold War, but a lot of people would probably disagree with that. And I suppose if terrorism is the greatest threat that Britain faces, that's not necessarily deterred by armed forces anyway, though.
No, they said...
And the Maghreb point is we're talking about Islamic insurgencies and militants.
Well, then you're talking about failed states. I mean, the state,
precisely.
If a state is not going...
So maybe soft power would be a better aspect.
Well, they would certainly say so, but that's always backed up. That might make it poke that's actually backed up with force. The credibility of the soft power is always backed up with knowledge that there is a deterrent aspect in that. Now that depends on what now that gets you into an argument about what and what is not a failed state.
John, is terrorism able to be deterred by armies and navies and things?
It can, in part. Defence doctrine through the ages has partly been concerned with countering what has been perceived as terrorism rather than just state-on-state actions. The smart point perhaps is just to recognise how complicated the world is. I mean, if we were having this conversation 4 weeks ago, we probably wouldn't be thinking of a European power changing the borders of another European state. You know, that's probably a scenario we're engaging with now. I think once we have notions of traditional geopolitics added to notions of terrorism, added to notions of potential future conflicts on food and water rights, coupled with a planet that is just oozing more and more population growth, I think we have a very unstable set of scenarios. Now whether that is countered exclusively by the military, that would probably be a foolish argument, but whether you want the military to be part of the toolkit that engages with those sense of problems and risks, that may be right.
You're talking about Russia and Crimea and the situation there. If Ukraine had been part of NATO, we would have had a very different scenario. In fact, it probably wouldn't have happened. So, but it's not one nation's army that would have prevented things. It's a collective agreement, effectively, that would have made the difference in that particular scenario.
And that goes right to the crux of the discussion for me, in that when we think about an individual state's responses to uncertainty in the 21st century, just like the previous century, we tend to think about that as forms of alliances, as forms of collective behaviours. We think of NATO in Afghanistan, probably not the UK's greatest operational moment. I think for sure Chris is absolutely right, but you're talking NATO plus another 20 or so contributing states. I mean, that's an enormous international commitment.
Don't we need to be a little bit more radical here and try and rethink the kind of general terms in which we engage in foreign policy? Because it seems to me that recent events, as you suggest, are making it clear that the world is a very, very dangerous place and probably becoming more dangerous. And yet this is happening at exactly the same time we're talking about the First World War. You know, the way that the West, the main powers in Europe, dealt with a fragmenting world back then was precisely to do the kind of things that are being advocated here, to create military alliances and to put military pressure on and so forth. It seems to me that, you know, it's quite scary and worrying that we seem to be repeating history 100 years on. And it seems to me that with Ukraine, it's exactly the NATO alliance spearheaded by the US that has created the tension that is beginning to pull apart, or at least has played a very important role in creating the tension that is in danger of pulling the country apart. I think we need to think again about this, and we need to think about political solutions and diplomatic solutions.
Well, absolutely, Chris, but you still have to live in the world you have, and you have a NATO border that is at Poland. Poland is next to Ukraine, and this is how...
It wasn't 20 years ago.
Oh, and it wasn't, but
but then maybe it shouldn't have been. You know, maybe we should rethink about saying our solution to the problem of Ukraine is to build a stronger military alliance, because actually the truth is that approach has been proved wrong. It's been proved that it failed.
Unfortunately, should have been don't solve anything. And that's trying to rerun history. That doesn't work.
No, but the opposite is true. We have to learn from history, or else we're doomed to repeat it. And it seems to me
I hope
that
we are. But it's a case of rolling back tensions. How do you roll back tensions? Do you roll back tensions by
not by strengthening military alliances?
On the alliance point, John, we're talking about Russia there in particular. When we see figures that, you know, China and Russia are increasing their military spending, China, they've announced a 12% increase on its military to £79 billion, although there are reports that it's a lot higher than that, and they're not quite revealing that. Should we be concerned at that? will that push us towards seeking kind of countries really thinking about working together, and perhaps just military spending and being on the ranking list is less important?
Point one, very difficult to actually get a handle on the defence expenditure within both Russia and China. I think point two is that when we look at what areas those monies are being spent in, both China and Russia are spending an awful lot of money on research and development. And there is a strong argument that, not too far down the road, both Russia and China as a collective will be spending more than Western powers on military and security research and development. And that is a concern but war in a traditional sense is usually constructed around having more men and women or having greater technology. And if Russia and China have more numbers and in the future they have greater technology, then that will drive some very interesting behaviours perhaps.
But is there a direct relationship between the amount you spend and the size of your armed forces and the security of the nation?
I think the difficulty, of course, is how that military power is projected and where the battle, if you like, is likely to be fought, because you look at the hotspots around the world and they're usually kind of cleavages between great powers or aspiring great powers, and that is remarkably dangerous.
Anthony, by 2030 the IISS says China will be the biggest military spender in the world. Should we be concerned about that?
It's a matter of regional security. People here will be more concerned about our own backyard. The Americans, on the other hand, are tied with treaties, as are we. We've still got treaties in Singapore and so forth. But what we can actually do in if such conflicts actually burst out, and, for example, there are ongoing disputes over islands and natural resources, I think it'd be limited. I think that's where we're organising ourselves so as to be limited in what we can do.
But there's no shortage of ambition, is there, John? I mean, there's the two biggest aircraft carriers ever built, costing £6 billion, going on at the moment.
It shows ambition, and it shows a remarkable ability to problem solve through really smart engineering. So if we look at the maritime programmes in the UK at the moment, the number of young women engineers working on both the Astute programme and the Carrier programme is absolutely remarkable. A scenario you wouldn't have had 30 or 40 years ago. I think the smart question, of course, is whether those technologies seep across into other programmes and whether those communities are useful for construction, HS2 and those sorts of things. I think that's where it really proves to be an economic driver.
Right, I think you've got to always have to keep in mind that all this is being developed in very, very tight purse strings. I mean, you have two carriers, but only one of them is going to be ever used at one time. They're still debating whether it's actually going to be officially mothballed. It will be built, but whether it's actually going to be deployed is something else entirely. The next warship program, the Type 26, that frigate, that's being pushed further back. That won't start until 2016.
But there's an accent towards maritime capabilities. Is that where Britain sees its future, perhaps?
It doesn't, in my view, it doesn't at the moment, but it should. We can do far more at sea, in my view, than we could on land.
So the UK are predominantly maritime power?
I think that thought is now returning to think tanks and politicians in and around London, that to really impact upon the world post 2020 in a way that conceptually we think we need to. The maritime instrument is profoundly significant, probably more significant than sort of upstreaming a few troops here and there and everywhere. So I think more people are now starting to think about maritime from right across the political spectrum as well.
On the agenda is what's going to happen post-Trident. Chris, what do you think will happen?
Well, I mean, I think in its current mood, the government is going to be involved in a Trident renewal, which, again, I just think is so out of touch with where public opinion is. I mean, we're talking about £80 billion or something.
And it's the most expensive part of the defence budget.
I mean, this, apart from anything else, would account for a significant amount of the budget deficit, which is what we're always told is the reason for the programme of cuts across the board. I mean, Trident is a weapon of mass destruction. It's completely useless for the for the world, even if you buy into the kind of general account of what Britain should be doing abroad, the official one. So, I mean, it's an absurdity that it's not being scrapped, and that's one of the main demands. But, I mean, how do we get out of this cycle of violence? We talk about escalation in China and Russia. Is it surprising that other powers feel they have to up their military spending, given what the West has been doing in the last 10 or 12 years? You know, we really shouldn't have gone to Afghanistan in the way we did. We shouldn't have done Iraq. We shouldn't have done Libya. We've got to stop doing this because it's going to exacerbate tensions in the world and you know, make the world into a very, very frightening place.
But on the Trident point, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose you could argue that this is from the Cold War. This is a defence capability born out of the Cold War, and there is the language of the Cold War being reintroduced into the mainstream narrative at the moment, especially with what's happening. So what's your view, John?
Point one is no power wants to be the first to play the give-up game. So if powers wants to stay at the top table, they want to have the toys and tools to enable them to stay at the top table. More interestingly, perhaps from a programmatic perspective, a heck of a lot of money has already been spent on the successor program to Trident, both in terms of the warhead and the submarine. So an awful lot of capability that we find with Astute would potentially find its way into the successor program if that was a submarine program as well. So a lot of these monies have already been spent, is point one. And I think, you know, when you add them up, you would get a different number from what potentially you need to spend in the future. How useful they are is a really sort of clever PhD for somebody. But I don't think Britain will give up its capability whilst Russia and China and others hold on to theirs.
And have we thought enough about what would happen if Scotland became independent? What would happen to Trident?
Yes, I was going through their white paper on the preparing for this, and it's very tiny forces. I mean, they have an army of 4,700, and that's when you start getting into the question of how small is useful. You know, you have an army that could be fit into a building. How is it useful to anybody themselves, to any sort of alliance who would ask them to contribute? Brings you back to the point of Britain's force numbers and how far the cuts will actually make them, Gates's point, not really a useful ally.
Chris, I suppose you might agree with what General Sir Nick Houghton said, the Chief of the Defence Staff. He said that the nation had become sceptical about the ability to use force in a beneficial way. But he did make the point that the public has a lack of understanding of the utility of force, and that's one of the greatest strategic threats to defence. I mean, what do you make of those comments?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's about any kind of hostility towards the armed forces, by the way. And I don't think we should be painted into that corner, because I'm not that you were. But you know, I think people feel a great deal of sympathy towards the military in all their guises. And in fact, I think people feel the problem is they've been misused by the politicians. And that's the fundamental problem here, and that the kind of policies we've been pursuing over the last period have just been straight wrong. Given what's happened, the idea that the British people have been wrong on defence is laughable. The British people actually were right about Iraq. The British people were right about Afghanistan and right about Libya. It's the politicians and the generals who've been wrong about in all three cases. So, you know, I think it would actually, given the record recently, it would actually serve them well if they listened a bit more to public opinion, which actually finally, thankfully, they did last year over Syria. And I think that was a big breakthrough, because the kind of democratic deficit that has been so in evidence around questions of foreign policy in the last period was finally overcome when the MPs, against the will of the cabinet, obviously, then the MPs just said, look, we can't push this one through. We can't start another war in the Middle East because people won't have it. And I think that shows, actually, on foreign policy, the good sense of the people of this country. And in that sense, I think the General's right. People don't like useless, pointless, wasteful wars.
Chris, do you think that feeling is going to accentuate over the next 2 years when Afghanistan is left very much to its own devices?
It depends how that scenario is analysed and understood, really, because, I mean, you know, it has been under occupation, after all, for 13 years, and, you know, if 13 years isn't enough to set it at least on a decent course, then presumably the whole occupation was wrong-headed.
But it's difficult, for sure, to see the upsides in Iraq, Afghanistan, certainly around
or Libya.
Certainly I was going to say the surge in Afghanistan in 2006 was, you know, very badly handled. I think most people would accept that. I'm less comfortable for that analysis to be played out across Libya. I think there was a strong argument for intervening in Libya, and I suppose where my analysis always takes me back to is if suddenly either the policy community, politicians, general public have no appetite for those sorts of interventions, then you reject the Balkans, you reject another Sierra Leone, and that's going to leave an awful lot of dead people on the planet that we could have saved.
On the question of Libya, I mean, the facts are that a few thousand people were killed, and that's regrettable, clearly, before we started bombing, before ourselves and the French and the Americans started bombing. 50,000 people died in the conflict afterwards. So just the casualty rate doesn't really support your position. But
those aspects are failures of military strategy, wouldn't you argue? And in fact, I interviewed Sir Hugh Strawn, who wrote the book The Direction of War, and he made the point that British defence policy has robbed itself of coherence and of credibility. So he's talking about strategic mistakes. These have a negative impact on Britain's reputation militarily in the world, don't they, John?
They have certainly an impact upon how we're perceived by others and how we're potentially perceived by our own populations. And it's important that public opinion plays a role in shaping sort of future stances and future ways of utilising the military instrument. The difficulty here is strategy is incredibly difficult. If you're going to undertake strategy from a budgetary position, then you may not have the capabilities you want. If you're going to look at what you need to do within a difficult and contested world, then you may possibly have to spend money. Whichever way you cut it, you'll probably end up doing things that you wouldn't really want to do.
Forces were sent into Iraq without sufficient body armour in snatched Land Rovers. Then we moved swiftly into Helmand. So it's a case of committing yourself to an operation to save political face, perhaps, and not having the wherewithal to do it. Now, perhaps they'd argue that even though those forces are reduced, they've got the equipment, they've got the kit to do it. They won't be able to spend. They won't be able to send the numbers, but at least those numbers. Well, at least those numbers will have those personnel will have the right kit.
I mean, the Conservatives traditionally believe in a strong military. The coalition government has cut spending on manpower. The budget's out this week. Will there be further cuts? If so, will the government be cutting too much? John, what do you think?
I don't think there will be further cuts. I think, if anything, within the UK, we'll probably see some sort of very minor growth in budgets from 2015 onwards. The big consideration now, though, is what are we all going to make of Russia? If we suddenly think that Russia is a threat, then you start looking at sort of budgets of 2.5-3% of GDP, and that would be a game changer.
I think we need a completely different set of priorities, and I don't think we're going to get them, unfortunately, on any front. I don't think we're going to have the kind of cuts in the military budget that most people would like to see, which would be very, very huge, swinging cuts, particularly when it comes to Trident and other things. But nor are we going to get a budget that actually puts money into the things that people need. We do have to be talking here about a kind of complete rethink of the kind of priorities for our society. And I say that partly because I think that is what the vast majority of people are looking for.
The matter of Russia have brought up all sorts of spectres again, and I don't think, given that you'll see any thought of the reduction in the successor programme, that was being on. And now is the time in the next few months when people will say, well, just how efficient was that SDSR, and how do we? Because that's the next one is due out in 14 months. Everything that's happening right now is going to have to flavour that next year.
So that's going to have an impact on the strategic defence.
It's bound to be, and things in Ukraine are bound to have an impact.
Thanks. That's Anthony Hall, former editor of Defence Management Journal. In the studio here also Dr. John Louth, who is Director for Defence Industries and Society at the Royal United Services Institute, and Chris Nineham, Vice Chair of Stop the War Coalition. Thank you for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.